Right now, as you lie here and listen to this, your body is spending money. Not dollars or euros, a different currency, far more ancient. Every single beat of your heart costs roughly 1 joule of energy. That is not much. It is less than what it takes to lift an apple about 3 feet off a table. But over the course of a day, your heart beats around 100,000 times, and by morning, you will have spent enough energy to lift a small car to the height of a 5-story building. And that is just your heart. Your liver is working. Your kidneys are filtering blood. Your brain is processing these words right now, turning sounds into images, deciding whether to keep listening. All of it costs energy. All of it is paid from the supply you topped up at dinner. And dinner got its energy from sunlight that warmed a field where wheat was growing, or from grass that a cow was eating. And that sunlight is the product of a thermonuclear reaction that is, at this very moment, burning 600 million tons of hydrogen every single second inside the core of a star roughly 93 million miles away from you. And that hydrogen came into existence in the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, almost 14 billion years ago. So the energy your heart is spending right now, on this very beat, was minted at the moment the universe was born. It did not appear out of nowhere. It was not created by your body. It came to you through a chain of transformations stretching back billions of years, from the explosion that created space and time, through clouds of hydrogen, through the furnaces of stars, through photosynthesis, through digestion. And here it is, right now, inside a chamber of your heart, pushing blood through your arteries so you can breathe and think and listen to this story. Let that sink in for a moment. You do not earn energy. You receive it through a chain that stretches back to the very beginning of time. You are spending a cosmic inheritance. And now, here is what makes this truly interesting. The energy you are spending does not disappear. The heat from your body seeps into your pillow, into the air of your room, and dissipates. Technically, it is still here, in this room, in this house, on this planet. But it has become useless. It has spread out into such a thin, even layer across the environment that it can never gather itself back together to push blood through an artery or lift a car again. The energy did not vanish. It lost its value. Like a coin that has been worn down so completely that no one will accept it as payment. This is, perhaps, the most important story that can be told about the universe. Not the story of stars and planets, not the story of life, not the story of civilizations, but the story of the invisible currency that stands behind all of them. A currency that was minted once, at the birth of the world, that cannot be counterfeited, cannot be created anew, cannot be multiplied, and that slowly, irreversibly loses its value with every passing second of the universe's existence. This story raises a few questions worth trying to answer. The first, what is this currency? For thousands of years, humans used energy without the faintest idea of what it actually was. What exactly is being transferred when a fire burns, when wind fills a sail, when a muscle lifts a stone? The second question, why can this currency never be created from nothing? Where does this strange and absolute prohibition come from? A rule that the entire universe obeys, from galaxies down to bacteria. Third, why does every transaction make this currency less valuable? Why does a cup of tea cool down but never heat itself back up? Why does a broken vase never reassemble? Why does time only flow in one direction? And the fourth, perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what happens when all the currency has been devalued? What will happen when the cosmic account hits zero? And will that ever actually happen? People have been searching for answers to these questions for more than 25 centuries, and the answers they found turned out to be both more beautiful and more frightening than anyone could have predicted. Tonight, we will walk the entire path. From an ancient Greek philosopher who stared into a flame and tried to understand what it was, to 21st century physicists who are trying to ignite a tiny star inside a magnetic donut. We will not rush. If you fall asleep somewhere along the way, that is perfectly fine. The story will still be here in the morning. It was here long before us and will remain long after. Let us begin. To understand how humans first encountered energy, we need to go very far back. Not to scientists, not to philosophers. To a moment when no science existed yet, and the word energy had never been spoken in any language on Earth. Somewhere between 1.5 million and 400,000 years ago, the exact date is still debated among anthropologists, one of our ancestors learned to control fire. Not to make it, that came much later. At first, just to keep it going. Lightning struck a tree, the tree caught fire, and someone was curious enough, or hungry enough, not to run away but to stay close. To throw on a branch. To watch the fire grow instead of die. To try a piece of meat that had accidentally fallen into the flames and discover that it was softer and tastier than raw meat. We do not know the names of these people.
We do not know exactly where it happened. Most likely in Africa, judging by archaeological finds in the Wunderwerk cave in South Africa and at the Gesher Benot Yaakov site in Israel, where traces of fire dating back roughly 750,000 years have been found. But we know what happened next, because the consequences are written in our bones. Cooking food over fire completely transformed human biology. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham at Harvard has convincingly shown that cooking allowed our ancestors to extract significantly more calories from their food. That same energy currency that pays for every action the body performs. More calories meant the ability to support a larger and more expensive organ, the brain. The brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy, even though it makes up only about 2% of its weight. Without fire, without that extra influx of calories, the human brain probably would never have grown to its current size. Think about that for a moment. Fire did not just warm our ancestors and protect them from predators. Fire literally paid for the development of the human mind. The very first energy transaction in the history of our species, and look at the result. But here is what matters. The people sitting around that first campfire had no idea what they were doing in a physical sense. They did not know why wood burns. They did not know what happens to a branch when it turns into ash and heat. They could see that something was being released, warmth, light, but they could not explain where it came from or where it went. Fire was useful long before it was understood. And in that gap between use and understanding, between practice and theory, lies one of the longest-running mysteries in the history of human thought. The first attempts to explain what fire actually is, and by extension what energy is, came from the ancient Greeks. Around the 5th century BC, the philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus, a city on the coast of what is now Turkey, put forward an idea that sounds strange, but contains a seed of something important. Heraclitus believed that fire was the fundamental substance of the world, the primary element from which everything arises and to which everything returns. The world, he said, is an ever-living fire, kindling and extinguishing in measure. From the perspective of modern physics, Heraclitus was, of course, wrong. Fire is not an element and not a fundamental substance. But the intuition itself, that behind all visible changes there is some single process, that at the root of motion, heat, and transformation lies one and the same thing, that intuition was strikingly close to the truth. It would take 24 centuries before science could say the same thing in precise language.
Heraclitus sensed the truth, but he did not have the tools to prove it. Other Greek thinkers took a different path. Empedocles proposed 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and 2 forces he called love and strife, which joined and separated these elements. Aristotle later adopted the 4-element system and added to it the idea of natural place. A stone falls because its natural place is below. Fire rises because its natural place is above. Motion, for Aristotle, is the process by which each thing seeks its proper place. When it reaches that place, motion stops. An elegant picture, logical at first glance, and almost entirely wrong by the standards of modern physics. But Aristotle did something important. He forced people to think about the causes of motion. Why do things move? What makes them stop? Where does force come from?
These questions would torment the finest minds for the next 2,000 years. Over the course of those 2 millennia, the question of motion and force remained open, and the answers offered by different ages tell us a great deal about how human thinking evolved. In the medieval Islamic world, scholars went further than Aristotle. In the 9th century, the Arab scholar Hunayn ibn Ishaq translated Aristotle's works into Arabic, and they became the foundation for further development. In the 11th century, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, observed that a moving body, if all resistance were removed, friction, air resistance, would move forever. This was a remarkable anticipation of Newton's first law, expressed 600 years before Newton. Ibn Sina introduced the concept of male, inclination or tendency, which describes something acquired by a body in motion and retained until external forces destroyed it. This closely resembles what Europeans would later call impetus, and eventually inertia. In the 14th century, Jean Buridan at the University of Paris developed the theory of impetus. When you throw a stone, your hand imparts to it a certain impetus that sustains its motion after the stone leaves your hand. Impetus is gradually used up, overcoming air resistance, and when it runs out, the stone falls. This was not quite right. In reality, a stone begins falling immediately after release, while simultaneously moving forward. But Buridan came closer to the truth than Aristotle, who could not explain at all why a stone continues to fly after the hand lets go. All of these were early approaches to the concept of energy, clumsy, groping, without the mathematical language that would allow precise description of what intuition was suggesting. What was needed was someone who would take the next step. Not just describe inclination or impetus, but measure it, show that it is conserved through transformations, and connect it to heat, light, and chemical processes. That someone was Leibniz. The first person who truly tried to capture this invisible currency and give it a name lived in Germany in the 17th century. His name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and he was one of the most remarkable people of his era. Leibniz was born in Leipzig in 1646, 2 years after the end of the 30 Years' War, which had devastated Central Europe. His father was a professor of moral philosophy who died when Gottfried was 6, leaving him an extensive library. The boy read everything: Latin, Greek, history, theology, and by 14 he was fluent in several languages. By 20 he had earned a doctoral degree in law. By 30 he had independently invented differential and integral calculus, separately from Newton. Beyond mathematics, Leibniz pursued diplomacy, jurisprudence, mining engineering, designed submarines and windmills, maintained a vast correspondence with hundreds of people across Europe, and wrote more than most people managed to read in a lifetime. But for all this restlessness, Leibniz had one obsessive idea, a red thread running through all his work. He was convinced that the world is a machine created by God, and that the laws of this machine can be understood if you look carefully enough at how things move and interact.
For Leibniz, there was no gap between philosophy and engineering, between theology and mechanics. To understand how a gear works is to come closer to understanding how the universe works. And so, in 1676, Leibniz asked a question that sounds simple, but turned out to be one of the most fruitful questions in the history of physics. What happens when two objects collide? Picture two billiard balls. One rolls across the table and strikes the other.
The first stops. The second begins to move. Something passed from one to the other. Something invisible, but entirely real, because the result is obvious. One ball stopped, the other rolled away. What exactly was transferred? Leibniz called it vis viva, living force. And he insisted that this was not just a convenient label, but a real physical quantity. A kind of substance that exists in the world in a fixed amount and passes from one body to another during collisions, but never arises from nothing and never disappears. God, in Leibniz's view, endowed the world with a certain stock of living force at creation, and that stock remains constant forever. Think about what he was really saying. He was saying that the universe contains something that is conserved, something that can be neither created nor destroyed, something that only passes from one form to another. This, given the language and concepts of the 17th century, is strikingly close to what 21st century physicists call the law of conservation of energy. To be fair, Leibniz's idea was not accepted without a fight. His great contemporary and rival Isaac Newton believed that what is conserved in collisions is not vis viva, but a different quantity. Momentum, the product of mass and velocity. The dispute between Leibniz and Newton, or rather between their followers, since both great men preferred to conduct their arguments through proxies, lasted decades and became one of the fiercest intellectual conflicts of the 18th century. Who was right? Both of them. Both quantities are conserved, but under different conditions. Momentum is always conserved, in every collision. Vis viva, what we now call kinetic energy, is conserved only in perfectly elastic collisions, where the balls bounce apart without losing any speed.
In real-world collisions, some kinetic energy is converted into heat, sound, and deformation, a loss that Leibniz could not account for. But total energy, including heat, is still conserved. Leibniz simply could not see this because in his time there was no understanding that heat is also a form of energy. The dispute between Leibniz and Newton lasted nearly a century. It was resolved, to everyone's surprise, by a woman, Émilie du Châtelet, a marquise, mathematician, physicist and translator, Voltaire's companion, and one of the most brilliant minds of the French Enlightenment. Du Châtelet showed in the 1740s that vis viva is proportional to the square of velocity, while momentum is proportional to the first power of velocity, and that both conservation laws are valid simultaneously but describe different aspects of motion. Her work was, unfortunately, forgotten for decades, a fate that too often befell the scientific contributions of women in that era. Leibniz saw something else, beyond billiard tables. He noticed that living force manifests not only in collisions. It is released when gunpowder burns. It is contained in steam bursting from a boiling kettle. It hides in a compressed spring and in the drawn string of a bow. And Leibniz wondered, what if this force could be captured? What if you could build a machine that intercepts the living force released by burning and converts it into useful work? This thought led him into a correspondence with Denis Papin, a French scientist who was then living in Germany and experimenting with steam devices. Papin had already built something like a prototype pressure cooker, a sealed vessel in which water was heated under pressure. He understood that steam possesses enormous force and believed that this force could be tamed. In one of his letters to Leibniz, Papin wrote words that sound almost prophetic. "I can assure you that the further I advance, the more reason I find to esteem this invention highly, which in theory can multiply human power to infinity, and in practice, I believe I can say without exaggeration, one man with its help will be able to do as much as 100 others without it. One person doing the work of 100, a dream of a machine that multiplies human capability tens, hundreds of times over. A dream of a new source of power, a new account in the energy bank that humanity had never before been able to access. But Leibniz and Papin never realized this dream. Their contribution was intellectual, not mechanical. They pointed the way. They saw that fire, steam, and gunpowder gases conceal enormous force, that this force obeys certain rules, and that those rules can be put to use. But turning these ideas into working machines required entirely different people. Not philosophers, but craftsmen, blacksmiths, engineers, and entirely different circumstances. And the circumstances were dramatic. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, England was experiencing a crisis that might seem impossible for a country covered in forests. The forests were gone. They still existed in patches, but they were catastrophically insufficient. Centuries of cutting, for building, for fuel, for ships to feed a growing navy, had made firewood in England more expensive than at any point in the country's history by the early 1700s. Richard Rhodes, in his book Energy, A Human History, describes this crisis in vivid detail. Cities were choking without fuel, prices climbed, the poor froze in winter. There was, however, an alternative source of heat, one that literally lay beneath their feet: coal. A black rock that burned hotter and longer than wood, deposited in enormous seams under the English countryside. The problem was that extracting it was extraordinarily difficult. The deeper miners dug, the more groundwater seeped into the shafts. Mines flooded. Coal was down there, water was down there, and pumping the water out to reach the coal required enormous effort. They used horses, dozens of horses walking in circles, turning pumps. But horses needed to be fed. They grew tired. They fell sick. And the depth to which water could be pumped by horsepower was limited. 18th century England was a country literally sitting on mountains of fuel. Coal seams stretched underground for hundreds of miles, from Newcastle in the northeast to Cornwall in the southwest. But this fuel was locked beneath water, and to reach it, you first had to solve a purely engineering problem: pump the water out. Miners of the era knew about flooding firsthand. Rhodes describes what it was like to work in a deep coal mine of the 1700s. Cramped tunnels you could only crawl through, suffocating air thick with coal dust, the constant threat of cave-ins, and water seeping from every crack, standing ankle-deep, knee-deep, sometimes flooding the face entirely. Miners could hear underground springs gurgling behind the walls and knew that sooner or later the water would win. They used everything available to fight the water. Chain pumps, an endless loop of buckets lifting water one scoop at a time. Buckets on ropes, hauled up by horse-powered winches. Drainage tunnels called adits. Horizontal passages driven into a hillside below the level of the mine, through which water drained by gravity. But adits only worked where the terrain allowed, and the deeper the mine went, the more useless they became. By 1700, some mines in Cornwall had reached depths of over 300 feet, and pumping water consumed more resources than mining coal. The situation was absurd. An enormous amount of energy, in the form of the muscle power of humans and horses, was being spent just to extract a little more energy in the form of coal. A fundamentally different approach was needed. What was needed was a machine that would work tirelessly day and night, without oats and without rest. a machine that would turn heat into motion. The very machine that Leibniz and Papin had dreamed of. And such a machine appeared, but it was built not by philosophers or academics. It was built by practical men, people who went down into the mines every day and knew the price of every ton of coal. Here begins one of the most striking paradoxes in the history of energy. To mine coal, you needed a machine that ran on coal. To gain access to a new source of energy, you had to spend that very same source. The first steam engines were not built to pull trains or spin factory looms. They were built to pump water out of coal mines. The machine fed on coal to extract more coal. For the first time, humanity had closed an energy loop, and hidden inside that loop was something far bigger than just a way to drain a mine. Hidden inside that loop were the laws that govern the universe. The first person to build a working steam pump was an English military engineer named Thomas Savery. In 1698, he received a patent for a device he called the miner's friend. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. You heat water in a sealed vessel until it turns to steam and fills the entire chamber. Then you splash the outside of the vessel with cold water. The steam condenses back into liquid, and liquid occupies roughly 1,600 times less volume than steam. A partial vacuum forms inside the vessel, and atmospheric pressure, the weight of the entire column of air above your head, pushes water from the mine shaft up into that vacuum. Savery had, in effect, put the atmosphere to work. About 15 pounds of pressure on every square inch. That is the weight of the air pressing down on everything around us all the time, which we never notice, the way a fish never notices the pressure of water if it has spent its whole life at the bottom of the sea. Savery found a way to make that pressure visible and useful. But the miner's friend had serious problems. Atmospheric pressure can lift water roughly 33 feet, and not an inch more. That is a physical limit you cannot get around as long as you are relying on the weight of the air alone. Mines often went much deeper. Savery tried using pressurized steam to push water higher, but the boilers and vessels of his era could not withstand high pressure. Seams burst, vessels cracked.
The machine was unreliable and dangerous. The person who actually solved the problem was Thomas Newcomen. And I like his story, because Newcomen was not a scientist. He was not a philosopher. He was an ironmonger from Dartmouth. He sold tools to miners and understood their needs from the inside. He spent years in quiet, unnoticed work, experimenting, failing, trying again. And around 1712, he built a machine that worked. Newcomen used the same principle: steam, condensation, vacuum, but added a key mechanical improvement. Instead of using the vacuum to pull water directly, he used it to drive a piston inside a cylinder. Steam filled the cylinder and lifted the piston. Then a jet of cold water was sprayed into the cylinder, the steam condensed, pressure dropped, and the atmosphere pushed the piston back down. The piston was connected through a large rocking beam to a pump in the mine shaft. Up and down, up and down.
About 12 strokes per minute, slow and heavy, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. There is one detail in the story of Newcomen's engine that I think says more about him than any biography could. The first engine, installed near Dudley Castle in Staffordshire in 1712, relied on a boy named Humphrey Potter to manually open and close the valves that let steam and cold water into the cylinder. 12 times a minute, hour after hour, without a break. According to legend, young Humphrey eventually tied strings from the valve handles to the rocking beam, and the engine began operating its own valves automatically. The boy freed himself from monotonous labor, and the engine actually ran more reliably, because a mechanical linkage does not get tired or distracted. Historians debate whether this story is literally true, but it captures an important principle. A machine that controls itself is a qualitatively different thing from a machine controlled by a human.
It is the seed of automation. Newcomen's engine was bulky. It was inefficient. It burned enormous amounts of coal for every drop of water it pumped. But it worked. It worked reliably, continuously, day and night, without horses and without rest. And crucially, it stood right on top of the mine, which meant right on top of its own fuel supply. Inefficiency did not matter much when coal was literally under your feet. What mattered was this: the water went away, and miners could dig deeper. By the mid-18th century, hundreds of Newcomen engines were nodding their rocking beams above coal mines across England and then across Europe. They became one of the defining technologies of the early industrial age. But here is something worth pausing to consider. None of the people who built and maintained these machines truly understood why they worked at a fundamental level. The practical questions, how to make the engine more powerful, more reliable, those had answers. But the theoretical questions remained wide open. How efficient can a steam engine be, in principle? Is there a limit? Could you ever build an engine that converts all heat into work with zero losses, or does nature impose some ceiling that can never be broken? The turning point came in 1769, when a young Scottish instrument maker named James Watt was given a model of a Newcomen engine to repair, belonging to the University of Glasgow. Watt started with a practical question: why does this machine consume so much steam? Why is it so hungry? And as he studied the device, he discovered something that previous engineers had missed. Every time cold water was sprayed into the cylinder to condense the steam, the water cooled not just the steam, but the cylinder walls themselves. And when fresh steam entered the cooled cylinder in the next cycle, part of that steam was wasted, spent merely on reheating the metal. The cylinder was alternately heated and cooled, heated and cooled. And in every such cycle, a great deal of heat was thrown away. Watt's solution was elegant. Move the condensation process into a separate vessel, connected to the main cylinder. The cylinder stays hot all the time. Steam flows into the condenser, condenses there, creates a vacuum, and the cylinder never needs to be reheated. Watt called this the separate condenser, and this idea, which came to him, by his own account, during a Sunday walk across Glasgow Green in the spring of 1765, changed the world. I like that detail, the walk across Glasgow Green. Watt described this moment many years later, and perhaps memory had polished it, giving it that cinematic clarity we love to attach to great breakthroughs. But even if so, the core remains true. The solution came not at a workbench, not in a laboratory, but during a leisurely stroll, when the mind was wandering freely, unburdened by the pressure of an immediate deadline. Many great ideas are born exactly this way, in the gap between effort and rest, when the brain continues to process a problem while freed from the demand for an instant answer. Watt, it should be said, was far more than a one-idea engineer. He invented the copying press, a device for duplicating documents that was used in offices for another century. He improved the steam engine in numerous other ways beyond the separate condenser. He introduced double-acting operation, where steam pushes the piston in both directions. He devised the centrifugal governor, a device that automatically maintains a constant speed of rotation, one of the first examples of automatic control in history. He created the Watt linkage, a mechanism for converting the straight-line motion of a piston into rotary motion. Each of these improvements made the engine more efficient, more reliable, more versatile. And Watt introduced a unit of power that we still use today: horsepower. He needed a way to explain to potential customers how many horses his engine could replace. So he ran a series of measurements and determined that an average horse could continuously lift a certain weight, a certain height, in a given time. 1 horsepower is the power needed to lift about 165 pounds, a height of 1 foot, in 1 second. Incidentally, a real horse can briefly produce 10 to 15 horsepower in a burst, but sustaining 1 horsepower continuously over a working day is about what an average draft horse can manage. Watt's business partner, Matthew Boulton, was an equally remarkable figure. The owner of a large metalworking operation in Birmingham, Boulton had exactly what Watt lacked: business instinct, connections, and capital. Their partnership, Boulton and Watt, became one of the most successful technology companies of the 18th century. Boulton understood that an engine needed not only to be built, but to be sold, serviced, and patented. He provided financing, found customers, negotiated with Parliament to extend the patent. When visitors toured his factory at Soho, Boulton reportedly showed them the steam engines and declared, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have: power." That is perhaps one of the most accurate statements ever made about energy. Boulton was not selling machines, he was selling power, the ability to do work, to reshape the world, to accomplish what had previously been impossible. He was selling access to a new account in the energy bank. With the separate condenser, the steam engine became several times more efficient. Less coal for the same amount of work. The economics of the machine improved dramatically, which meant steam engines became profitable not only at coal mines where fuel was free, but everywhere. In textile mills, at grain mills, at iron foundries. Watt and Boulton mass-produced steam engines, and by the early 19th century, steam had transformed England and then the entire Western world. The scale of this transformation is hard to overstate. In 1800, a few hundred steam engines operated in England, mostly at mines. By 1830, there were roughly 15,000, driving textile factories, ironworks, printing presses, and mills. By 1850, the steam locomotive had become the primary mode of transport in England, and a rail network covered the country like a spider's web. Steamships crossed the Atlantic. Steam-powered presses printed newspapers in volumes unthinkable a generation earlier. Rhodes describes how the energy transition from wood to coal, and then from coal as fuel to coal as a source of mechanical work via the steam engine, transformed the very fabric of society. People moved from villages to cities because steam-powered factories were concentrated in cities. The rhythm of life changed. Instead of the seasonal cycle of agriculture, there was continuous work in 3 shifts. Children went to factories instead of fields. The air in industrial cities turned black with soot. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds choked in coal smoke. Every energy transition in human history, as Rhodes notes, has followed the same pattern. The old source became exhausted or insufficient. The new one met fierce resistance, but ultimately prevailed, not because it was better in some abstract sense, but because it delivered more energy for less cost. The transition from wood to coal was not smooth or painless. Coal was dirtier than wood. Its smoke was harsher. Its extraction more dangerous. People did not want to switch to coal. Necessity forced them. There simply was not enough wood left. In the same way, the transition from muscle power to steam was not painless. The Luddites smashed textile machines, seeing them as threats to their livelihoods. Horse-drawn carriage drivers protested against railroads. Canal companies, which transported goods along man-made waterways, lobbied against locomotives. Every energy transition created winners and losers, and the losers never went down without a fight. Here is something worth reflecting on. Why does every energy transition meet such resistance? And not just from those who lose money and influence, but from ordinary people who, you would think, should welcome cheaper and more abundant energy. The answer, I believe, is that every energy transition changes not just the economy, but the culture, the rhythm of life, the very sense of what it means to be human. A woodsman in Elizabethan England lived in a world where energy was organic, slow, seasonal. Trees took years to grow before they could be cut. Coal shattered that tempo. It did not grow, it was mined. And you could mine as much as you wanted if you had enough labor and machinery. Oil shattered the bond between energy and place. It could be shipped across oceans in tankers. Nuclear energy shattered the familiar ratio between fuel volume and energy output. A pinch of uranium replaced mountains of coal. Each time, humanity had to readjust to energy becoming something different, more concentrated, more available, more powerful. And each time, that adjustment took decades, was accompanied by crises, and forced people to rethink their way of life.
Victorian England, the first civilization completely rebuilt around fossil fuel, was simultaneously dazzling in its success and appalling in its cruelty. Children worked in mines for 14 hours because their small bodies could fit into narrow tunnels. London suffocated in smog, the famous pea soupers, dense yellow-green fogs that killed hundreds on bad days. Rivers were poisoned by industrial waste. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so polluted with sewage that Parliament could not sit because of the unbearable smell, was a direct consequence of the energy boom. Steam engines made it possible to concentrate millions of people in cities, but infrastructure could not keep up with growth. It was precisely to solve London's sewage crisis that the magnificent Crossness pumping station was built, with its 4 great beam engines. But more on that in a moment. Factories, railways, steamships, all of these were ways of using the heat of burning coal to do useful work. Humanity, in the language of our metaphor, had opened a new bank account. Muscle power, human and animal, had been the small change that people used for millennia. Coal and steam were a deposit made by carboniferous forests 300 million years ago, compressed by the pressure of geological strata, patiently waiting for someone to learn how to cash it in. By the 1850s, the locomotive had cut journey times from London to Edinburgh from 4 days by mail coach to under a day. The world shrank. Cities that had been isolated worlds became nodes in a single network. Farm produce could reach a city in hours instead of days. Workers could live in suburbs and commute to factories by train. Steam created the modern world. Not just industry, but the very geography of human settlement. There is a place in southeast London that conveys, better than any textbook, the almost religious seriousness with which the Victorians regarded the power of steam. It is called Crossness, a sewage pumping station built in 1854. From the outside, it looks like an ordinary industrial building. Inside, it is astonishing. Columns with ornate cast iron work that evokes a Greek temple, vaulted ceilings, decorations worthy of an opera house. Inside stood 4 massive beam engines, consuming thousands of tons of coal a year. And all this splendor was built for the purpose of pumping sewage. Think about what that means. Steam had become so central to British power and prosperity that even a sewage station deserved the adornments of a palace. Steam was not merely a technology. Steam was the foundation of an empire. It was precisely to solve London's sewage crisis, the Great Stink had made it impossible to ignore, that Crossness and its sister stations were built.
Steam engines had created the problem by making possible the concentration of millions in cities. And steam engines solved it by pumping the filth away. Such is the irony of energy transitions. Each new source solves the problems of the last one, but creates new, often unforeseen ones of its own. But for all its might and all its success, a nagging question remained. No one truly understood what was happening inside a steam engine at a fundamental level. An astonishing thing, Those enormous, clumsy, nodding machines that we picture when we think of early steam engines were, in fact, the seed of an understanding of everything that happens in the universe. As unlikely as it sounds, steam engines helped us understand the cosmos. To answer the fundamental questions about how a steam engine works, the world needed someone who cared not just about machines, but about the laws governing the entire universe. A young French engineer who had lived through a military humiliation and decided to strike back, not with weapons, but with understanding. His name was Nicolas Leonard Sadi Carnot, and his story is one of the most beautiful and tragic in all of science. In March of 1814, Paris found itself under siege. Napoleon and his main armies were fighting far to the east, and the capital was left nearly defenseless when the combined forces of Russia, Prussia, and Austria reached the city walls. Everyone who could hold a weapon was thrown into the defense, including very young cadets from the École Polytechnique, France's finest engineering school. One of those cadets was 18-year-old Sadi Carnot, the son of Lazare Carnot, a distinguished mathematician, military strategist and politician who had been called the organizer of victory for his role in directing France's revolutionary armies. Young Sadi had grown up in a family where intellectual discipline and strategic thinking were the usual atmosphere. But on that March day, he found himself not behind a desk, but at positions near the Château de Vincennes, under artillery fire that a group of inexperienced students could not hold back. They were forced to retreat. For Carnot, this was a personal humiliation. France, great France, the France of Napoleon, had been defeated. And defeated not only on the battlefield, the technological superiority of the British, built on steam power, was one of the reasons behind the economic and military strength of the coalition. British factories produced more weapons. British ships were more powerful. British industry supplied the Allied armies with things France could not manufacture in sufficient quantity. Carnot came back from the war with a firm resolve. He would understand how steam engines work, not at the level of an engineer, but at the level of the fundamental laws of nature. He wanted, in his own words, to uncover the source of British power. Carnot wrote bluntly, "Take away Britain's steam engines, and the British Empire collapses." And he, a young officer on half pay, proposed to analyze the very source of that power by investigating the principles of fire and heat engines. Living with his brother Hippolyte in the small Parisian apartment, 28-year-old Carnot wrote a slender book in 1824, fewer than 60 pages. It was titled Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire. This modest little booklet became one of the most important scientific texts ever written. Carnot did something no one had done before. He abstracted away from the specific details of any particular engine, pistons, boilers, connecting rods, and asked a pure question. Suppose we have a perfect machine. No friction, no heat leaks, no losses of any kind. An absolutely flawless engine. Would there still be a limit to its efficiency? Could you ever convert all the heat fed into it into useful work? To answer this, Carnot used an analogy familiar to every engineer of his time: a watermill. How much work a watermill can do depends on two things: the amount of water and the height from which it falls. The greater the drop, the more work. Carnot proposed that a heat engine works on the same principle. Heat falls from a hot source to a cold sink, and in the process of that fall, work can be extracted. The greater the temperature difference between hot and cold, the more work you can get. Carnot was reasoning within the framework of the caloric theory, the then dominant idea that heat is a kind of weightless fluid flowing from hot to cold.
this theory would later prove wrong.
But remarkably, and this is a case where the right architecture is built on a flawed foundation, Carnot's main conclusion turned out to be absolutely correct. Here is that conclusion. The efficiency of a perfect heat engine depends only on the temperatures of the hot source and the cold sink, on nothing else. Not on the working fluid. Use steam, air, mercury, anything you like. Not on the design, not on the material, only on the temperatures. And no real engine can ever be more efficient than this ideal one. Carnot had discovered a ceiling imposed by nature itself. You can be the most brilliant engineer who ever lived. You can eliminate every loss, perfect every component. But you will never exceed the Carnot efficiency. The universe simply will not allow it. The only way to reach 100% efficiency would be to have a cold reservoir at absolute zero. And absolute zero is physically unattainable. Some fraction of the heat will always be wasted, lost to the environment without doing any work. Always. This is why a car engine is more efficient than a steam engine. It operates at a higher temperature. And why a jet engine is more efficient still. The temperature in a jet engine's combustion chamber is significantly higher. Carnot's principle has guided engineers for 200 years and continues to guide them today. It is worth emphasizing how deep Carnot's contribution was. He essentially proposed the first thought experiment in thermodynamics, an idealized machine that could never exist in reality, but that allowed him to derive fundamental limits applying to all real machines. This method, studying ideal, impossible systems to understand real ones, would become one of physics's most powerful tools. Einstein would use thought experiments to build the theory of relativity. Schrödinger would use them to formulate quantum paradoxes. But Carnot came first, a young officer in a cramped Parisian apartment. And here is something else remarkable. Carnot not only found the efficiency limit, but also determined the conditions under which that limit is reached. His ideal engine, the Carnot cycle, operates infinitely slowly, passing through a sequence of equilibrium states. Any speeding up of the process introduces irreversible losses and pushes efficiency below the Carnot limit. In other words, the faster you want to get the work done, the less efficient your engine will be. Perfect efficiency demands infinite patience. There is something almost philosophical about this. The universe seems to be saying, you can have the maximum, but only if you agree to wait forever. Any haste costs extra energy. Any impatience is paid for with rising entropy. Hurry is, in the most literal sense, wasteful. But Carnot never saw what impact his ideas would have. In 1832, a cholera epidemic swept through Paris, killing nearly 19,000 people. In that era, there was no scientific understanding of how the disease spread, and one can only imagine the horror. Carnot, fearless by nature, set out to study and document the epidemic's progression. He contracted cholera and died within a day. He was 36. Most of his manuscripts were burned. The standard practice of the time meant to halt contagion. In the few surviving notebooks, there are hints that before his death, Carnot was already moving away from the caloric theory, that he was beginning to understand heat is not a fluid, it is a form of motion. He may even have estimated the numerical relationship between heat and mechanical work. But all of this burned along with the papers in that Parisian apartment. The book, however, survived, though almost nobody read it. Carnot held no prominent academic position and was not widely known. The book was printed in a small run and went largely unnoticed. His ideas were rescued from oblivion by the French engineer Émile Clapeyron, who in 1834 published a paper restating Carnot's arguments in rigorous mathematical form with elegant diagrams. It was through Clapeyron
that Carnot's ideas reached the two men who would erect the formal structure of thermodynamics: William Thompson, later Lord Kelvin, and Rudolf Clausius. But before we turn to them, we need to talk about what was happening in parallel, because thermodynamics was born not from one source but from several, converging toward a single point. While Carnot was thinking about engine efficiency in France, people in other countries were approaching a related but entirely separate question. What is the exact relationship between heat and mechanical work? Can you measure how much work a given amount of heat produces? For this, you first need to understand what people of that era thought about the nature of heat. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the dominant theory was the caloric theory we have already mentioned. Heat was believed to be a weightless, invisible fluid called caloric. A hot body contains a lot of caloric, a cold body little. Caloric flows from hot to cold, like water flowing from a high container to a low one. The idea was intuitively appealing. Antoine Lavoisier, the great French chemist who discovered the role of oxygen in combustion and who lost his head on the guillotine, considered caloric to be a real element, as real as hydrogen or oxygen. One of the first to doubt the caloric theory was Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, a man with a biography that reads more like an adventure novel than a scientist's life. Born in Massachusetts, he spied for the British during the American Revolution, fled to England, was knighted, moved to Bavaria, reorganized the Bavarian army, invented a more efficient fireplace, and founded the Royal Institution in London. Somewhere amid all these adventures, around 1798, while in Munich observing the boring of bronze cannon barrels at a military arsenal, Rumford made a key observation. Drilling a hole in a bronze blank generated enormous heat. The bronze glowed. Cold water had to be constantly poured over everything, and Rumford noticed something that did not fit the caloric theory at all. The heat kept coming. As long as the drill turned, heat flowed and flowed without weakening. Even a blunt drill that barely removed any metal produced enormous heat. If caloric were a fluid contained within the bronze, it should eventually run out, like water squeezed from a sponge. But it never ran out. The source of heat seemed inexhaustible, provided that mechanical work continued. Rumford concluded, "Heat cannot be a substance. It must be connected to motion." He was right, but he did not offer a complete alternative theory, and the caloric theory held on for decades. Too convenient, too elegant to be discarded on the basis of one experiment with cannon barrels. The person who drove the final nail into the caloric coffin was James Prescott Joule. And I am especially fond of his story, because Joule had no connection to the academic world. He was a brewer. His family owned a brewery in Salford, near Manchester, and Joule inherited not only the business, but the habit of precise measurement. In brewing, every fraction of a degree matters, every percentage of sugar content in the mash. Joule became consumed by an idea. If heat and work are truly connected, there must be a precise, fixed conversion rate. A given amount of mechanical work must always produce a given amount of heat. And vice versa, like an exchange rate between two forms of the same currency. To measure this rate, Joule built an elegant apparatus. A falling weight connected through a string and pulleys to a paddle wheel submerged in an insulated container of water. The weight falls, the wheel turns, stirring the water, and friction between the paddles and the water heats it. Joule measured how far the weight dropped and the rise in water temperature with Joule's precision. We are talking about fractions of a degree Fahrenheit. He repeated the experiment dozens of times. He tried different methods, compressing gases,
forcing water through narrow tubes, using electric currents. And every method produced the same number. A given amount of work always produced a given amount of heat, without exception. The rate was fixed, like the exchange rate of the gold standard. Work and heat turned out not to be two different things, but two forms of the same thing.
Joule first presented his results in 1843, and, like Carnot before him, he was largely ignored. The scientific establishment looked skeptically at a brewer from Manchester without a university position, claiming to have discovered a fundamental law of nature using homemade instruments. The breakthrough in attitudes came at a scientific conference in Oxford in 1847. Joule presented a paper, and in the audience, ready to disperse indifferently, a young Scottish physicist named William Thompson, the future Lord Kelvin, raised his hand. Thompson asked several precise questions that showed he, unlike most of those present, understood the significance of Joule's work. A friendship formed between the two scientists that would last decades and prove one of the most fruitful scientific partnerships of the 19th century. But Joule was not alone. Almost simultaneously, independently and often without knowing of each other, similar conclusions were being reached by Julius Robert Mayer, a German physician who had noticed that the venous blood of sailors in the tropics was unusually red and wondered why, and Hermann von Helmholtz, a brilliant Berlin physiologist and physicist. Helmholtz published his paper On the Conservation of Force in 1847, formulating the principle of energy conservation in its most general form. Mayer's story deserves a moment because it is extraordinary. He was a ship's doctor. In 1840, sailing near Indonesia, he noticed that the venous blood of sailors in the tropics was unusually red, almost like arterial blood. Mayer knew that the dark color of venous blood results from oxygen being consumed to oxidize nutrients in the tissues, generating body heat.
But in the tropics, the body needs less heat to maintain temperature, so less oxygen is consumed and venous blood stays redder. From this simple clinical observation, Mayer made a giant theoretical leap. Body heat and muscular work are forms of the same thing. The body is a machine that converts the chemical energy of food into heat and motion, and the total balance must add up. Mayer, not being a physicist by training, did not always phrase his ideas in language the physics community could follow, and his work was largely ignored. He suffered a severe depression and attempted suicide, and was for a time placed in a psychiatric institution. Only late in life was his contribution recognized. Three people, Mayer, Joule, Helmholtz, arrived at the same law independently, from different directions, in different countries, under different circumstances. A doctor watching the blood of sailors, a brewer measuring the temperature of water, a physiologist studying muscle work. Each of them saw part of the picture, and when the three fragments came together, the picture turned out to be grand. All the energy in the universe is the same currency, and its total amount is unchanging. By the mid-19th century, once Joule's results were finally accepted, and the ideas of Helmholtz, Mayer, and others merged into a unified picture, physicists realized something astonishing. Heat and mechanical work are manifestations of a single fundamental property that they named energy. Light is also a form of energy. Electricity is a form of energy. Chemical bonds are a form of energy storage. Sound is a form of energy. And all of these forms can be converted into one another at a fixed rate. And here is the culmination. The total amount of energy in the universe is constant. Energy does not arise from nothing and does not vanish without a trace. It merely passes from one form to another.
In a steam engine, the chemical energy of coal becomes heat, heat becomes mechanical work, work becomes the motion of a train, and some heat dissipates into the atmosphere. But if you add it all up, the work, the heat of the escaping steam, the warming of the rails from friction, the sound of the whistle, the total balance adds up. Not a single calorie is gained, not one is lost. This became known as the first law of thermodynamics. In the language of our metaphor, it says something fundamental about the invisible currency of the universe. The balance always adds up. You cannot create energy from nothing. That would be cosmic counterfeiting. You cannot destroy energy. The universe keeps its books with absolute, merciless precision. Every transaction, from the collision of billiard balls to the explosion of a supernova, is neatly recorded in the cosmic ledger, and the bottom line is always the same.
And here it is worth pausing for a moment, because the first law of thermodynamics is more than just a physical law. It is a worldview. It tells us that the universe is a closed system with a fixed budget. Nothing can be created from nothing. Every joule spent here was first obtained from somewhere. Every action is a transfer of energy, not a creation of it. For people in the 19th century, this had enormous philosophical significance. It meant the end of a centuries-old dream of perpetual motion, a machine that would work without any energy input, creating motion from nothing. Patent offices in every developed country by the mid-19th century were buried under proposals for perpetual motion machines. Ingenious systems of levers, wheels, magnets, and fluids that, according to their inventors, should spin forever, doing useful work without any fuel. The first law of thermodynamics explained why none of these designs work, and never will. You cannot get energy from nothing.
The balance must add up. The French Academy of Sciences had declared as early as 1775 that it would no longer consider perpetual motion proposals. But inventors did not give up, and still have not. Every year, patent offices around the world receive applications for devices that, their creators claim, violate the first law. None of them works. The balance always adds up. Leibniz, 2 centuries earlier, had intuitively guessed this law when he spoke of the conservation of living force. Now the law had been proven experimentally, measured in numbers, and elevated to one of the paramount principles of physics. The first law of thermodynamics is perhaps the most comforting thing science has ever said about the universe. Nothing is lost. Nothing vanishes. Everything is conserved. But here is the thing. If energy never disappears, if its total amount is constant, then why can we not use the same energy over and over again? Why can coal, once burned, not be unburned? Why does a cup of tea cool down and never ever heat itself back up? Why are we constantly forced to find new sources of energy if the old energy has not gone anywhere? The first law says, the balance always adds up. But it says nothing about why energy, while formerly preserved, becomes less and less useful. It does not explain why the cosmic currency loses its value. For that, we need another law, the second. And it turns out to be considerably darker than the first. Rudolf Clausius was born in 1822 in Koslin, in Pomerania, on the Baltic coast, in the family of a Protestant pastor. He studied in Berlin, showed brilliant mathematical ability early on, and became a professor while still young, first in Berlin, then in Zurich at the newly founded Federal Institute of Technology, later in Bonn. Clausius was a man who was careful, methodical, and outwardly undramatic, the complete opposite of the romantic figure of Carnot.
But it was he who took the next step, without which thermodynamics would have remained incomplete. Clausius's path to entropy began with a careful reading of Carnot, or rather, of Clapeyron, who had rendered Carnot's ideas in mathematical form. Clausius noticed that Carnot, despite the erroneous caloric theory, had grasped something fundamental. There is a directionality in the processes of heat exchange. Heat does not simply pass from one form to another. It does so in a particular way, at a particular cost. Clausius started by reconciling two seemingly contradictory results. On one hand, Joule had shown that heat and work are equivalent. They can be converted into each other at a fixed rate. On the other hand, Carnot had shown that there is a limit to the efficiency of this conversion. You cannot turn all heat into work. How was this possible? If heat and work are the same thing, why can you not fully convert one into the other? Clausius resolved this contradiction by showing that in every conversion of heat into work, some heat inevitably leaks from the hot body to the cold one without doing any work. And this leaking flow cannot be eliminated. It can be reduced by increasing the temperature difference, but it cannot be removed entirely. Nature takes its cut from every transaction, a tax that cannot be evaded. To describe this tax, Clausius introduced the concept of entropy in 1865. The word itself he constructed on the model of the word energy, from the Greek root trope, meaning transformation. Clausius wanted the name to echo energy, because entropy was, in his view, energy's inseparable companion. Wherever energy is transformed, entropy inevitably grows. They are linked like light and shadow. In 1865, Clausius formulated two great postulates that he considered the fundamental laws of the universe. The first, the energy of the universe is constant. The second, the entropy of the universe tends toward a maximum. Two laws, two sentences, and in them was compressed the essence of everything science knew about the fate of the cosmos. The first says nothing is lost. The second says everything is degraded. Here is what Clausius showed mathematically. In any closed system, entropy can only increase or stay the same. It never decreases on its own. Let us translate this into our metaphor. The first law says the amount of currency is constant. You cannot print new money, and you cannot destroy old money. The second law adds something different. With every transaction, some of the currency loses its value. Technically, it has not gone anywhere. The money is still in circulation, but it has become useless. Imagine a banknote torn into the tiniest shreds and scattered across a stadium. Every shred still exists. The total sum has not changed, but gathering it back together and buying something with it is impossible. This is why you cannot use the same energy forever. The chemical energy of coal, when burned, becomes heat. Hot gases, glowing ash, infrared radiation. This heat dissipates into the environment, warming the air by infinitesimal fractions of a degree over a vast area. Technically, the energy has not been lost, but it has spread among so many molecules, become so thin that extracting useful work from it is no longer possible. It has been devalued. Clausius was so confident in his mathematics that he extrapolated the conclusion to the scale of the entire cosmos. The entropy of the universe, he wrote, tends toward a maximum. Everywhere, in all processes, from the burning of a candle to the shining of a star, energy dissipates, entropy grows, and this process is irreversible. The universe as a whole moves from order to disorder, from concentration to dispersal, from usefulness to uselessness. This became the second law of thermodynamics.
And a remarkable trait of Victorian scientists was their ability to make such dizzying leaps, from a thermometer in a glass of water to the fate of the entire universe. They saw that their observations about heat and steam carried cosmic significance. But there remained a tormenting question. Entropy is a mathematical quantity defined through the equations of Clausius. What does it mean physically? What actually happens when entropy increases? Why does it always increase? The equations described the process but did not explain its cause. For the explanation, it took a man willing to look deeper than anyone before him, into the very fabric of matter, at a level that many of his contemporaries considered unobservable and even non-existent. His name was Ludwig Boltzmann. He was born in Vienna in 1844, and his life became one of the most tragic stories in science. Boltzmann did not resemble the stereotypical scientist. Emotional, impulsive, prone to sharp mood swings, periods of feverish productivity alternated with deep depressions from which he emerged only with great difficulty. He loved music passionately, Wagner's operas, Beethoven's sonatas, and was an excellent pianist, capable of losing himself in playing for hours. He could just as completely immerse himself in mathematical calculations, losing all sense of time. His students recalled lectures that started chaotically and haltingly, but by the end coalesced into a strikingly coherent picture. Boltzmann thought not linearly, but in leaps, and his intuition often outran his ability to explain himself. In the second half of the 19th century, a small group of physicists was advancing a hypothesis that many considered too bold to be true: that matter is composed of tiny particles, atoms and molecules, in constant motion. Today, we accept this without question, but in Boltzmann's era, atoms were speculation. No one had ever seen an atom. No one could measure one directly. For many respected physicists of the time, atoms were a convenient fiction, a computational trick with no bearing on reality. Let me illustrate why the second law matters so much, with one everyday example that may help anchor the understanding. Imagine you are sitting in a room with a burning fireplace. The fireplace heats the room by burning wood. The chemical energy of the wood becomes heat, and the room grows warm. The first law is satisfied. The energy of the wood has not disappeared. It has simply become the heat of the air, the walls, the furniture. Now imagine the reverse process. You are sitting in a warm room, and you want the heat in the air to gather itself back into the fireplace and turn into unburned logs. The first law does not forbid this. The total energy would remain the same. But it will never happen. You could wait until the end of the universe. The heat in the air will not reassemble into firewood. Why? Because heat distributed across the entire room, across trillions upon trillions of air molecules, is a state with a colossally large number of possible arrangements. Each molecule can move in any direction at any speed, and there are inconceivably many such chaotic combinations. A state in which all that energy is neatly concentrated in the chemical bonds of wood cellulose has a very small number of arrangements. The transition from the small number to the large one will almost certainly happen. The reverse almost certainly will not. Almost is the key word. Boltzmann understood that the second law is, strictly speaking, not an absolute prohibition, but a colossal statistical improbability. In theory, all the air molecules in a room could randomly, simultaneously move in the same direction, creating a gust of wind. In theory, heat could spontaneously flow from cold to hot. But the probability of such events is so small, described by a number with billions of zeros after the decimal point, that in the entire history of the universe, not one of them has ever occurred and, for all practical purposes, never will. This is what sets the second law apart from other laws of physics. It does not say impossible. It says so improbable that you may as well call it impossible. This is a subtle distinction, But for Boltzmann it was fundamental, and it was precisely because of this distinction that he faced such fierce criticism. His opponents insisted that the laws of physics must be absolute, not statistical. How can a law be almost always true? That, they said, is not a law but an observation. Boltzmann replied that the difference between absolutely impossible and impossible with a probability of 1 minus a number with a trillion zeros after the decimal point is a difference that has no practical meaning whatsoever. He was right. But he could not convince his contemporaries.
Boltzmann belonged to those who believed in the reality of atoms. More than that, he saw that the atomic hypothesis could explain what Clausius could not: why entropy always increases. His reasoning was simultaneously profound and surprisingly simple when stated without formulas. Imagine a piece of hot metal lying on a cold table. The atoms of the metal are moving fast. That is what it means to be hot. The atoms of the table are moving slowly. That is what it means to be cold. When the fast atoms at the surface of the metal collide with the slow atoms of the table, they transfer some of their speed. The slow ones speed up. The fast ones slow down. Heat gradually spreads from a concentrated state, all the fast atoms gathered in the metal, to a dispersed one, speeds distributed more or less evenly between the metal and the table. Why does this process go in only one direction?
Boltzmann's answer is disarming in its simplicity. Because there are incomparably more ways to be dispersed than to be concentrated. Imagine a deck of cards. A new deck is ordered. Aces together, twos together, each suit in sequence. Shuffle it. The probability that after shuffling the cards will return to perfect order is vanishingly small. The probability that they will end up in some disordered arrangement is close to 1. Not because there is a law forbidding order, but simply because there are incomparably more disordered arrangements than ordered ones. The same holds for atoms. A state in which all thermal energy is concentrated in one place, a hot piece of metal on a cold table, is a very special state, one of very few. States in which energy is distributed evenly are colossally, inconceivably more numerous. So a system left to itself naturally drifts toward the more probable state, toward even distribution, toward disorder, toward dispersal. Not because a force pushes it that way, but simply because the overwhelming majority of possible paths lead there. Boltzmann expressed this in an equation that became his eternal monument. S equals K log W. Entropy is proportional to the logarithm of the number of microstates, the number of ways atoms can be arranged without changing what we observe at the macroscopic level. This equation is engraved on his tombstone in Vienna. Clausius showed that entropy always increases. Boltzmann explained why. Because disordered states outnumber ordered ones. The arrow of time, the direction from past to future, the feeling that time flows forward, is, according to Boltzmann, simply a statistical effect. Time moves in the direction entropy grows, and entropy grows because probability steers the world toward disorder. But the same emotions that led Boltzmann to one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science had a destructive side. Throughout his life, he suffered from severe bouts of depression. Between his lectures at various universities and his agonizing disputes with opponents, Boltzmann found comfort in two things: music and nature. He loved hiking in the Austrian Alps, loved swimming, loved spending time with his family. His wife, Henrietta, one of the few people who could pull him out of his episodes of despair, patiently supported him for decades. They had 5 children. But by the early 20th century, the attacks on his theories grew fiercer and the depressive episodes longer and heavier. After one of his lectures on atomic theory in Vienna, the great Austrian physicist Ernst Mach rose and uttered a single sentence: "I do not believe that atoms exist." For someone as vulnerable as Boltzmann, such a statement from the most authoritative scientist in the room was a devastating blow. Critics insisted that atoms were merely names, labels, convenient computational tools that had no existence in reality, that no one had ever observed them and never would. They called Boltzmann a fantasist. In 1902, Boltzmann survived a serious suicide attempt. He was saved, returned to work, but the shadow did not retreat. He complained to friends that he felt like the last of the Mohicans of atomic theory, that the whole world had turned against him. This was an exaggeration. He had followers and allies. But depression distorts perception, and Boltzmann saw the world through its lens. In September of 1906, during a family holiday in the Italian town of Duino, near Trieste, while his wife and daughter were at the beach, Boltzmann took his own life. He was 62 years old. The most bitter irony is that within just a few years of his death, atoms were conclusively confirmed experimentally. Einstein in 1905 explained Brownian motion, the chaotic jittering of dust particles in water, as the result of impacts from invisible molecules. Jean Perrin carried out experiments confirming Einstein's calculations. Atoms were real. Boltzmann was right. His ideas, ridiculed during his lifetime, became the foundation of modern physics. But he never knew. The irony, and perhaps the bitterest irony in all of physics, is that by the time Boltzmann died, his victory was virtually assured. Einstein's paper on Brownian motion, published in 1905, a year before Boltzmann's death, already contained the argument that within a few years would convince even the most stubborn skeptics. If Boltzmann had lived 5 more years, just 5, he would have seen Perrin experimentally confirm the existence of atoms, and even Ostwald publicly admit he had been wrong. Boltzmann won. But he never found out. The equation on his tombstone, S equals K log W, contains within it the mortality of everything. Of every object, every living being, every star, the universe itself. Entropy increases, order crumbles, time flows in one direction. Boltzmann's equation is the mathematical expression of the simple observation with which we began. A cup of tea cools down and never heats itself back up. A broken vase does not reassemble. The universe is unwinding like a spring, and when the spring is fully unwound, motion will stop. Physicists of the late 19th century called this the heat death of the universe. Lord Kelvin was among the first to voice this idea, and it made a grim impression on his contemporaries. The universe will not explode or collapse, it will simply cool down. Quietly, slowly, irreversibly. All temperature gradients will flatten out, all stars will burn out, all processes will cease. Eternal, uniform, dead silence. The idea of heat death made a profound impression on the Victorian age. For people who believed in progress, in endless improvement, in the triumphant march of civilization, and the Victorians believed in this passionately, the realization that the entire universe is inexorably moving toward purposeless uniformity was a shock. Bertrand Russell wrote, "All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." But there were also those who found a strange comfort in this. If the universe is doomed anyway, if nothing lasts, then every moment of order, every instant of consciousness, every beautiful building and every scientific theory, all of this is a miracle. A temporary miracle, yes, but all the more precious for being temporary. The German physicist Arnold Sommerfeld once said that thermodynamics is the only theory of general scope in which he is confident it will never be overturned. Einstein put it even more strongly. A theory based on thermodynamics will never be overthrown. And indeed, in a century and a half since the laws of thermodynamics were formulated, no experiment and no observation has refuted them. Quantum mechanics changed our understanding of atoms. Relativity changed our understanding of space and time. But the first and second laws of thermodynamics stand unshaken. The balance adds up, entropy grows, and as long as physics exists, these two statements will remain true. But if everything in the universe tends toward disorder, if entropy relentlessly increases, if order crumbles, then how do we explain the existence of stars themselves? How do we explain planets, oceans, mountains? How do we explain you, an extraordinarily complex structure of trillions of cells, each containing DNA molecules with billions of base pairs organized with surgical precision? If the universe is moving from order to chaos, where did all this dazzling, staggering splendor of order come from? The answer turns out to be one of the most beautiful and unexpected twists in all of science. Complexity and order arise not in spite of the second law, but because of it. And to see how this works, we need to return to our metaphor, but look at it from an entirely different angle. Imagine a waterfall. Water falls from top to bottom, from high to low, from concentrated to dispersed. It is unstoppable. But as it crashes against rocks, droplets fly off. These droplets are temporary, doomed to fall back. But for a moment, they form structures more beautiful than the stream itself. The universe works the same way. The overall direction is from order to disorder. But in this great falling, structures emerge. Stars, planets, living creatures, civilizations. Each is temporary. Each will break down. But while it exists, it feeds on the flow of energy from concentrated to dispersed, intercepting part of the flow to maintain its own order. Take a car engine. The tank holds gasoline, concentrated chemical energy in long hydrocarbon chains. When it burns, this ordered energy turns chaotic. Hot gases expand. Heat escapes through the engine walls and tailpipe, through tire friction and engine noise. Entropy has increased. But on the way from order to chaos, the engine snatched a portion and used it for something ordered, spinning the wheels, moving over 2,000 pounds of metal at a controlled speed. The engine inserts itself into the flow from order to disorder and steals energy for useful work. The chaos generated by combustion far exceeds the order the engine creates. The second law is satisfied. Now think about your body, right now, as you listen. You eat a chocolate bar. Your body breaks it down into heat, carbon dioxide, and water, scattered, low-value forms. Entropy increased. But along the way, your body intercepted part of that energy for stunning processes, contracting muscle fibers, conducting electrical impulses along nerves, synthesizing DNA with 1 error per billion copies, repairing cell membranes. You are a spray droplet from a waterfall, a temporary, complex structure existing on energy flowing through you from order to chaos. As long as the flow continues, as long as you eat and breathe, you maintain your pocket of order. When the flow stops, order breaks down. That is what death is in the language of physics. Cessation of energy flow, after which the second law takes over. Erwin Schrödinger, in his 1944 book, What is Life?, put it this way: a living organism feeds on negative entropy. Life sustains itself by exporting disorder into its environment. A plant absorbs ordered sunlight and releases scattered heat, but builds complex sugars and proteins from carbon dioxide and water. An animal eats the plant and releases heat and waste, but builds muscles, bones, and a nervous system.
Schrödinger's book inspired Watson and Crick, who discovered DNA structure in 1953. The physics of energy, born from questions about steam engines, led to understanding life itself. From Carnot to DNA, one logical chain, one physics. The universe is unwinding like a spring. But in the process, it creates something extraordinary. Stars that synthesize heavy elements. Planets where those elements form mountains and oceans. Life that uses energy flow for self-organization. Minds that become aware of all of this. Each level of complexity is temporary, but while it exists, it forms a staircase from simple to complex. And this staircase is built not in spite of the laws of physics, but because of them. We exist because the universe is unwinding. If it had fully unwound, there would be no stars, no planets, no life. If it were not unwinding at all, there would be no flow to intercept. We live in a narrow window. The universe has begun unwinding, so energy flows exist. But it is far from fully unwound, so gradients remain. This window is our home, and it is very, very wide. Earth's biosphere is a giant machine in the flow from sun to cold space. The sun radiates concentrated visible light photons. Earth absorbs them and re-radiates infrared, photons carrying much less energy each. The balance is maintained, but the quality has changed. On this gradient, all life runs. Earth does not stockpile solar energy. It passes it through itself, like a watermill passes a river, intercepting part of the flow for its astonishing order. The entire history of human energy is finding ever more concentrated sources to cash in. Wood was first, coal second, roughly twice the energy per pound. Oil third, about 1.5 times more per pound than coal, and liquid, far easier to transport. A pound of uranium gives as much energy as roughly 6.5 million pounds of coal. The difference between wood and uranium, about 5 million to 1. Humanity learned to open ever tighter safes. The first commercial oil well was drilled by Edwin Drake in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859. A retired railroad conductor, he convinced investors that oil could be pumped from underground. Locals called it Drake's Folly. When the well, barely 70 feet deep, began producing, the folly became a gold rush. Oil was initially for lamps. The internal combustion engine changed everything. Combustion inside the cylinder made engines compact enough for cars, light enough for planes. Oil gave humanity what steam could not: mobility. The 20th century became the age of oil. Wars were fought over oil fields. Oil shaped cities, agriculture, geopolitics. And it created the problem we face today. Burning fossil fuels has raised atmospheric carbon dioxide by about 50%, warming the planet roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt glaciers and intensify extreme weather. Every energy transition in history followed the same pattern. The old source became insufficient. The new one met fierce resistance, but ultimately prevailed because it delivered more energy for less cost. And every transition created unforeseen consequences. We are living through such a transition right now. But the tightest safe lay not in geological strata. It lay in the nuclei of atoms. Before we open it, we need to talk about the discovery that made the whole modern system possible: electricity. Michael Faraday was born in 1791 in Newington Butts, a poor London suburb. His father, a blacksmith, was often ill. Education ended at 13, apprenticed to a bookbinder. But a bookbinder has access to books. He read the Encyclopaedia Britannica on electricity and Jane Marset's Conversations on Chemistry. In 1812, he attended Humphrey Davy's lectures at the Royal Institution, took meticulous notes, bound them into a volume, and sent it to Davy, asking for work. Davy hired him. Colleagues looked down on him,
But Faraday had extraordinary experimental intuition and fearlessness before the unknown. By the 1820s, Ørsted had shown that electric current deflects a compass needle. Electricity produces magnetism. The reverse question remained: can magnetism produce electricity? On August 29, 1831, Faraday answered it. Iron ring, 2 coils, battery on one side, galvanometer on the other. Switch the current on, the needle twitches. Switch off, twitches again. A brief current appears in the disconnected coil, but only when the magnetic field changes. A steady field produces nothing. This was electromagnetic induction, behind every generator on Earth. A spinning magnet creates a changing magnetic field, inducing current in a coil. Weeks later, Faraday built the first generator, a copper disc spinning between magnet poles. Before Faraday, energy was local, tied to its source. With a generator and wires, energy could travel. A mountain waterfall could light a city lamp 100 miles away. Energy broke free from place. In our metaphor, electricity became a wire transfer. Edison launched the Pearl Street Station on September 4, 1882. 85 buildings lit up. The end of dependence on the solar cycle. But direct current transmits poorly over distance. Tesla proposed alternating current, whose voltage can be stepped up for transmission and down for delivery. The war of currents ended with Tesla's victory at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, 200,000 bulbs, and the Niagara Falls plant in 1895, sending power 20 miles to Buffalo. Faraday never learned higher mathematics. He thought in lines of force. Maxwell, born in Edinburgh in 1831, translated Faraday's intuitions into 4 equations describing all electromagnetic behavior.
When Maxwell calculated the speed of his electromagnetic waves, he got 186,000 miles per second, the speed of light. Light is an electromagnetic wave. Energy can travel without matter as pure field oscillations across 93 million miles of empty space. Electric light changed sleep. People now average about 2 hours less per night than their ancestors. Electricity enabled the telegraph, the telephone, radio, television, computers, the internet. Electric current is not just energy, it is an information carrier. This dual nature made modern civilization possible. Einstein called Faraday the greatest experimentalist in history. Faraday died in 1867, declining a knighthood. His gravestone bears only a name and dates, but every generator on Earth is his monument. By the late 19th century, the invisible currency had many forms: work, heat, chemistry, electricity, magnetism, light. All interconvertible, all obeying both laws of thermodynamics. The tools were in place. Then a young patent clerk wrote 3 symbols that would overturn everything. E equals mc squared. In 1905, a 26-year-old patent clerk in Bern named Albert Einstein published 4 scientific papers, each of which changed physics forever. One of them contained a small addendum, 3 pages, showing that if a body emits energy as light, its mass decreases. And the reverse, if you add energy to a body, its mass increases. The relationship was described by the formula that would become the most famous in history. E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. The speed of light is about 186,000 miles per second. The square of that is a number with 16 digits. Even a tiny amount of mass holds a staggering amount of energy.
1 gram of any substance, a paper clip, a grain of sand, a drop of water, contains as much energy as burning roughly 20,000 tons of coal. 1 gram, 20,000 tons. In everyday life, we never notice this. When wood burns, it loses mass, but so little that no scale on Earth can detect it. All the chemical energy we have discussed, burning wood, coal, oil, is just a faint ripple on the surface of the ocean of energy locked inside matter. Chemical reactions rearrange electrons on the outer shells of atoms. They do not even approach the nucleus. To reach the truly deep level, you have to go inside the atom. And here, a different story begins. In 1896, the French physicist Henri Becquerel discovered something strange. He accidentally left uranium salts next to a wrapped photographic plate in a drawer. When he developed the plate, it showed a clear imprint, the silhouette of the uranium. The salt was emitting invisible radiation that passed through paper and exposed film. Continuously, without any external energy source. Where was this energy coming from? Marie Curie, the young Polish scientist working in Paris who coined the term radioactivity, and her husband Pierre began systematically studying uranium ores. Working in a damp, cold shed without proper ventilation, processing tons of ore by hand, they discovered 2 new radioactive elements, polonium and radium. Radium was 1,000,000 times more radioactive than uranium. A tiny piece glowed in the dark and was warm to the touch. It constantly radiated energy that seemed to come from nowhere. Curie received 2 Nobel Prizes, the only woman in history honored in 2 different fields, physics in 1903 and chemistry in 1911. But years of working with radioactive materials without protection led to chronic poisoning. Her laboratory notebooks remain so radioactive today that they are stored in lead containers. She died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused by years of radiation exposure. The answer to where the energy came from required looking inside the atom. In 1911, Ernest Rutherford in Manchester fired alpha particles at thin gold foil. Most passed through as if the foil did not exist, but roughly 1 in 8,000 bounced straight back. Rutherford later said this was the most incredible event of his life, almost as incredible as firing a 15-inch shell at tissue paper and having it bounce back at you. The explanation: nearly all an atom's mass is concentrated in a tiny, incredibly dense nucleus, occupying less than 1/trillionth of the atom's volume. If the nucleus were the size of a pea at center field of a football stadium, the nearest electron would orbit somewhere up in the bleachers. Between the pea and the bleachers, nothing. Empty space. And in that pea, the nucleus.
was locked nearly all the atom's mass, and therefore, by Einstein's formula, nearly all its energy. The nucleus is held together by the strong nuclear force, the most powerful force in the universe, acting only at incredibly short distances, but they're overpowering the electromagnetic repulsion between protons by hundreds of times. Splitting a heavy nucleus, say uranium, into two fragments releases a portion of this binding energy. The fragments weigh slightly less than the original nucleus, and the difference, by E equals mc squared, becomes energy. Nuclear fission was experimentally discovered in December 1938 by German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. They bombarded uranium with neutrons and found barium, an element half the weight of uranium, in the products. The uranium nucleus had split in two.
The physical explanation came from Lise Meitner, an Austrian physicist who had worked with Hahn for decades but had been forced to flee to Sweden under Nazi racial laws. Sitting on a bench in a snowy Swedish forest on Christmas 1938, Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch realized what had happened. The uranium nucleus, having absorbed a neutron, became unstable and divided, like a droplet stretching and splitting in two. Meitner calculated that each fission event released about 200 million electron volts. For scale, burning one carbon atom releases about 4 electron volts, 200 million versus 4. Nuclear reactions yield roughly 50 million times more energy per atom than chemical ones, and each fission releases 2 or 3 free neutrons. Each of those can strike another uranium nucleus and cause it to split, which releases more neutrons, which cause more fissions. A chain reaction.
With enough fissile material, a critical mass, the reaction becomes self-sustaining. Uncontrolled, this is an atomic bomb. Controlled, it is a nuclear reactor. The path from understanding to realization was shockingly short. From the discovery of fission in December 1938 to the first controlled chain reaction in December 1942, exactly 4 years. From the first chain reaction to the first nuclear explosion, less than 3 years. For comparison, from Faraday's discovery of induction to Edison's first power station, 51 years. Why so fast? The answer is simple and dark. War. The Manhattan Project received roughly $2 billion, equivalent to about $30 billion today, and employed over 130,000 people. On December 2, 1942, under the stands of an abandoned squash court at the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi and his team started the first nuclear reactor, a crude pile of graphite blocks and uranium chunks they called Chicago Pile No. 1. Cadmium rods inserted into the pile absorbed neutrons and slowed the reaction. Pull the rods out, the fission rate increases. Push them in, it decreases. That day, for 28 minutes, humanity achieved controlled release of nuclear energy. The power output was half a watt, less than a flashlight, but the principle was proven. 30 months later, on August 6, 1945, the bomb called Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. About 80,000 people died instantly. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. E equals mc squared is not an abstraction. It is a reality written in the ashes of 2 Japanese cities. The energy the universe had locked inside atomic nuclei since the synthesis of heavy elements in dying stars was released in a fraction of a second. But the same energy could be, and was, used for creation. The first commercial nuclear power station, Calder Hall in England, began operating in 1956. The principle is simple. A controlled chain reaction produces heat. Heat boils water into steam. Steam spins a turbine connected to Faraday's generator. The generator sends electricity through wires to homes and factories. A nuclear power plant is essentially a steam engine whose heat source is splitting uranium rather than burning coal. The scale of the difference is staggering. 1 pound of uranium-235, fully fissioned, yields as much energy as roughly 3 million pounds of coal. A coal train carrying that much fuel would stretch for miles. The equivalent uranium would fit in your palm. Nuclear energy came with its own nightmares.
Chernobyl in 1986, Fukushima in 2011. Radioactive waste that remains dangerous for thousands of years. Each crisis was a reminder that the safe we opened holds danger as well as treasure. Every step deeper, from wood to coal, from coal to oil, from oil to the nucleus, gave exponentially more energy but required exponentially deeper understanding. To cash in wood, you needed to strike a spark. To cash in coal, you needed steam engines. To cash in nuclear fuel, you needed to understand atomic structure, discover neutrons, calculate critical mass, build a reactor. Each deeper safe demanded a more sophisticated key. When we split uranium in a reactor, we release energy locked by a stellar explosion 5 billion years ago. We are caching a deposit left by a dead star. But even fission is not the final level. There is a still deeper safe, still more concentrated nuclear energy. To reach it, you do not split heavy nuclei, you fuse light ones, joining hydrogen nuclei, the simplest and most ancient element, into helium. This process is called thermonuclear fusion. It powers the sun and every star. And it is what humanity has been reaching for over the past 70 years. In Oxfordshire, among green English fields, stands a building that looks like an ordinary industrial complex. It is called the Culham Centre for Fusion Energy. Inside is a machine trying to solve a problem physicists have wrestled with for decades. Ignite a tiny star on Earth and hold it long enough to extract energy. The machine is called a tokamak, from a Russian abbreviation meaning toroidal chamber with magnetic coils. Inside, 2 forms of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium, are heated to a plasma.
When the plasma reaches roughly 270 million degrees Fahrenheit, about 10 times hotter than the core of the Sun, hydrogen nuclei move so fast that they overcome their electrical repulsion and fuse, forming helium. Each fusion event releases a neutron and a burst of energy. But holding plasma at 270 million degrees is extraordinarily difficult. No material can withstand such temperature, so the plasma is contained by a magnetic field generated by powerful electromagnets in the tokamak's walls. The field forces the charged plasma particles into spiral paths inside the chamber, never touching the walls. The plasma floats in emptiness, held by invisible magnetic walls. The Sun is a fusion reactor held together by its own gravity. Gravity compresses hydrogen in the Sun's core to a density 15 times that of lead and a temperature of about 27 million degrees Fahrenheit.
On Earth, we lack a star's gravity, so we compensate with even higher temperatures and magnetic confinement instead of gravitational. A colossal engineering challenge, but physics says it is solvable. Every second, the Sun converts roughly 620 million tons of hydrogen into about 615.5 million tons of helium. The difference, about 4.5 million tons, becomes pure energy via Einstein's formula. 4.5 million tons of mass vanishing every second. The Sun has been doing this for 5 billion years and will continue for roughly 5 billion more. ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, being built in southern France with the participation of 35 countries, aims to demonstrate that fusion can produce 10 times more energy than it consumes. If ITER meets its goals, The next step is a demonstration power plant that will, for the first time, feed fusion electricity into an industrial grid. Hydrogen does not need to be mined or drilled. Deuterium is found in ordinary seawater. 1 gallon of seawater contains enough deuterium that, if fused, it could replace roughly 300 gallons of gasoline. The oceans hold an essentially inexhaustible supply of fusion fuel. If fusion is mastered, it would mean access to a practically unlimited, clean, safe energy source. No carbon dioxide, no long-lived radioactive waste, and the fuel supply would last billions of years. Think about what the tokamak is doing in terms of our metaphor. It is extracting the most ancient, most primordial currency in the universe. The hydrogen loaded into the tokamak is the simplest element, the first to form after the Big Bang. Hydrogen nuclei, protons, were forged in the first minutes of the universe's existence. This is the oldest asset in the cosmic portfolio, nearly 14 billion years old. And it still holds the energy deposited at the birth of the universe.
Now let us step back and see where we have arrived, and which of the big questions from the beginning have been answered. The first question: what is this currency? We now know. Energy is the universe's fundamental capacity to cause change. It takes many forms: kinetic, potential, thermal, chemical, electromagnetic, nuclear, and mass itself, frozen energy, locked in every piece of matter by Einstein's formula. All forms are interconvertible, and in this sense, energy truly is a universal currency. The second question: why can it never be created from nothing? The first law of thermodynamics: energy does not arise from nothing and does not vanish. The total was set at the Big Bang and has not changed by a single joule since. The balance always adds up. The third question: why does every transaction devalue it? The second law and Boltzmann's explanation. Every conversion disperses some energy into chaotic thermal motion, useless, irrecoverable. Entropy grows because disordered states vastly outnumber ordered ones, and statistics inexorably steers the world toward the most probable, that is, the most disordered condition. Cosmic inflation: the currency is preserved in quantity but degraded in quality. The fourth question: what happens when the account empties, deserves a fuller answer. If we take the second law literally and extrapolate it across infinite time, we arrive at heat death, maximum entropy, all temperature gradients smoothed out, all stars long extinguished, all black holes evaporated through Hawking radiation. The universe, a vast, uniform expanse, at a temperature barely above absolute zero. No processes possible because no gradients remain to exploit. The waterfall has stopped. The spray has long since fallen. But here is what is interesting. We live in an incredibly early universe. Since the Big Bang, roughly 14 billion years have passed, and stars will continue to shine for trillions more. The last red dwarfs, the most frugal stars, spending their hydrogen fuel with extraordinary thrift, will not burn out for another 10 trillion years. We are at the very beginning of cosmic history. And there is another mystery. In 1998, 2 teams of astronomers observing distant supernovae independently discovered something staggering. The expansion of the universe is accelerating. Galaxies are flying apart, not simply by the inertia of the Big Bang. Something is pushing them, and that something is growing stronger over time. Physicists called it dark energy. By current estimates, dark energy makes up about 68% of the total energy content of the universe. Ordinary matter, everything we see, know, and are made of, accounts for less than 5%. 68% of the universe is something we do not understand. We know it exists because we see its effect. But what it is, where it came from, how it connects to the rest of physics. These questions have no answers yet. Dark energy may be the biggest mystery in modern science. Sometimes people ask, what comes next? What energy source follows fusion? The honest answer? We do not know. But history suggests a pattern. Each new source was unlocked by deeper understanding of nature, chemical energy through chemistry, electricity through electromagnetism, nuclear energy through atomic physics. If the pattern continues, the next source will come from a branch of physics not yet understood. Dark energy is an obvious candidate for speculation, though wildly premature. 68% of the universe's energy budget is a colossal account we cannot access. Could dark energy ever be harnessed? Today, this sounds roughly the way the question, can we get energy from atoms, would have sounded in 1850. Absurd, fantastic, on the border of science fiction. But exactly such absurd questions have driven this story for 25 centuries. The sun pours more energy onto Earth every second than all of humanity uses in a year. The problem was never a shortage of energy. It was always the ability to intercept, concentrate, and deliver it. Fire was the first method. The steam engine was the second. The electric generator was the third. Solar panels and wind turbines are the fourth. A fusion reactor, if we build it, may be the fifth. Each is a more refined way of tapping into the great flow from order to chaos, intercepting a portion of energy and using it to sustain our small, impossibly complex pocket of order on the third planet from an unremarkable star on the edge of an unremarkable galaxy. Solar panels intercept photons on their way from the sun to the warm ground. Wind turbines intercept air moving from high to low pressure. Hydroelectric dams intercept water on its way from mountain lakes to the sea. All are spray from the waterfall, temporary structures existing on the flow. In a sense, this is a return to origins. Before the Industrial Revolution, all human energy was renewable. Wood, wind, water, muscle power fueled by plants, fueled by sunlight. Fossil fuels were a historical detour. 2 centuries of consuming energy savings the planet accumulated over hundreds of millions of years. The shift to renewables is, in a way, a return to living on current income instead of eating through savings. The difference is that now we have the knowledge of Carnot, Clausius and Boltzmann, Maxwell's equations, Einstein's formula, Faraday's generators, and semiconductor technology. We are returning to the sun, but at an entirely different level. Let us pause and survey the distance we have covered. The campfire gave early humans roughly 10 kilowatts of thermal power. Newcomen's engine, roughly 7.5 horsepower, but has mechanical work, not just heat. Watt's engine, about 70 to 130 horsepower. A modern coal-fired power plant, about 1 million kilowatts. A nuclear plant, several million. If a fusion reactor is built, its output will be in the millions of kilowatts, with a virtually unlimited fuel supply. In 10,000 years, a blink by cosmic standards, humanity has increased available power 100,000-fold. And every leap in power was accompanied by a leap in understanding. Without Carnot, no efficient engines. Without Faraday, no power stations. Without Einstein, no nuclear energy. Knowledge and power walked hand in hand. And now, let us return to where we started, to your body, to this room, to this moment. Right now, as you listen to this, or perhaps are beginning to drift off, your heart is making another beat. 1 joule of energy, energy that was minted at the birth of the universe, passed through the furnaces of stars, through photosynthesis, through digestion, and here it is, inside a chamber of your heart, pushing blood through your arteries. This energy will not disappear. It will become the warmth of your body, seep into your pillow, into the air of the room, lose its value, disperse. But it will not be lost. It will exist as long as the universe exists, just in a different, less useful form. And here is what I think matters about all of this. The entire grand story, from Heraclitus staring into a flame and seeing the world's foundation, to physicists at Culham trying to ignite a star in a magnetic donut, from Leibniz first naming living force, to Boltzmann seeing the answer to entropy in atoms, from Newcomen pumping water out of mines, to Einstein linking mass and energy with an equal sign. This entire story leads to one understanding.
We are temporary, incredibly complex patterns in a flow of energy that runs from order to chaos. We are spray from a waterfall. The waterfall is unstoppable. The spray will someday fall. But right now, in this instant, we exist. We think. We ask questions about the universe and get answers. And that fact, that a piece of the universe can become aware of the laws by which the universe is built, is perhaps the most remarkable transaction ever made in the invisible currency of the cosmos. Throughout this long story, we talked about people who uncovered the laws of energy. Leibniz, Carnot, Joule, Clausius, Boltzmann, Faraday, Maxwell, Einstein. Each saw a part of the picture no one had seen before, and each paid for it in their own way, with time, health, sometimes life itself. Carnot died of cholera at 36. Boltzmann took his own life at 62. Curie was killed by radiation. Faraday spent his last years losing his memory.
But each left behind something time cannot destroy. Understanding. The laws of thermodynamics, Maxwell's equations, Einstein's formula. These are perhaps the most durable structures the human mind has ever built. Buildings crumble, empires fall, even mountains are worn away by wind and water. But E equals mc squared will be true 1,000,000 years from now, and 1,000,000,000, and when Earth itself is nothing but dust. Truth is not subject to entropy. And perhaps that is the answer to the unsettling fourth question. What remains when the account empties? What is left when entropy reaches its maximum, when all stars have burned out and the universe has cooled? Matter will disperse, energy will be devalued. But the laws by which all of this happens, the very laws we described in this story, they do not depend on the state of the universe. They are true outside of time. They were true before the Big Bang and will remain true after heat death. Whether they exist for anyone in an empty, cooled universe is a question for philosophy, not physics. But I like to think that truth is the one currency that cannot be devalued. We stand at the edge of the waterfall. Behind us, 14 billion years. Ahead, trillions. We do not know whether we will find energy sources we cannot yet imagine. We do not know what dark energy is or what surprises it holds. We do not know whether we will succeed in igniting a star of our own and powering civilization for millions of years. But we know the rules. The balance always adds up. Entropy always grows. And in the spray of this great waterfall, things arise that are worth seeing. The laws of physics have given us this brief, beautiful, creative moment in the great cosmic unwinding. And my hope is that by understanding the universe ever more deeply, we can stretch this moment across many millions, perhaps even billions of years. For now, just breathe. Every breath costs roughly half a joule. Every breath is a small transaction in the invisible currency of the universe. Every breath continues a chain stretching back to the very beginning of everything. Sleep well. In the morning, you awake, and your body, having spent roughly 100 kilocalories overnight on maintaining temperature, repairing cells, processing memories, will ask for breakfast. You will eat something, oatmeal, an egg, a piece of toast, and top up your account by a few hundred kilocalories more. That energy came from the sun. The sun got its hydrogen from the Big Bang. The Big Bang minted all the currency that will ever be in circulation. And while you drink your morning coffee, somewhere in Oxfordshire, a physicist will switch on a tokamak. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, a technician will brush sand off a solar panel.
Somewhere in Norway, a waterfall will spin a turbine. Somewhere in space, 93 million miles away, 600 million tons of hydrogen will become helium in a single second. All of it, transactions. All of it, the circulation of one and the same currency. All of it, spray from one and the same waterfall. Good morning.